In, I believe, our first lecture of this term, we discussed the administrative and the political structure of Dnipro, Ukraine, that is Ukrainian lands in the Russian Empire, which we are still discussing. And as we stressed then, there was no real distinct Ukrainian political entity during our long historic 19th century, which we know begins in the 1770s and ends in 1914. Political autonomy, such as it was, ended on Ukrainian lands in the late 18th century with the abolishment of systematically the autonomous status of Sloboda Ukraine, then the steppe Ukraine or Zaporozhia, and then the Hetmanate. That is, all of the autonomous entities disappeared at the very beginning or just before the period that we are discussing, and therefore Dnipro, Ukraine was an integral part of the Russian Empire. And within this Russian Empire, Ukrainian lands, I believe to reiterate, were simply composed of the so-called Little Russian provinces, the official term that the Russian Empire gave to Ukrainian lands, Little Russia, and ethnic Ukrainians themselves referred to as officially as Little Russians. And so this area was no more than a local region within the Russian imperial political, administrative, and socioeconomic structure. That being the case, the idea of something specifically Ukrainian could not derive, or for that matter, survive solely on indigenous elements. Something new had to be found, perhaps from the outside. And that new force was found. And it did come from outside, beyond Ukraine. It was the phenomenon we know as nationalism. Brief definition, stated in the most simple terms, nationalism is an ideology which divides humanity into nationalities, and which argues that the optimal social system for these nationalities is when they enjoy complete cultural and, to a large degree, political autonomy, self-rule, ideally, if it were possible, complete sovereignty and independence. And what are nationalities? Nationalities, sometimes incorrectly designated in English as nations, which really refers to states. Nationalities are groups of people who are united or who perceive themselves to be united because they may have one or more of the following common characteristics, and those common characteristics are listed on the chart which I handed out to you. Common territory, language, historical tradition, religion, culture, that is kind of ethnographic factors, and then sociocultural values, mentalité, attitudes toward life. Now, there are two important aspects in this definition that are worth remembering. One is subjective, that is perception. The other, objective, that is these common characteristics that I just mentioned and that are clearly listed here. First, the subjective matter. Many groups of people actually could call themselves ethnic or ethnographic groups, and these ethnic or ethnographic groups also have common characteristics, such as those we've just been speaking about. They may not realize, however, that they have things in common with people, other people, and hence not realize that they belong to a larger national group or nationality. In other words, it is the existence of a sufficiently large number of people who perceive themselves as being united. And that is what makes the difference between a nationality on the one hand and just an ethnic or an ethnic group on the other. And so these qualities of perception, together with a will or a desire, are all important factors in determining the existence of a nationality. The second aspect, objective phenomena. This is related to the number of those common characteristics that we have here on our chart that are associated with nationalities. Now remember this is not unimportant. The presence or the absence of any one characteristic does not in itself determine the existence of a nationality. So you don't have to have all of them. You have to have a lot of them, but not necessarily all of them. In this context, we might as well mention here, because this comes up very often in discussions of stateless peoples, frequently language is used as the so-called determining characteristic. That is, a nationality must have its own distinct language in order to be considered a nationality. Or conversely, if a group does not have its own language, it is not a nationality. This equation, language equals nationality, doesn't take much effort to see that it is not borne out by evidence. And so, for instance, the Irish, or the Scots, or the Swiss, or the Americans, even Canadians, they all comprise nationalities even though they never had, or in the course of time, for instance, the Scots, lost a distinct language. Now, as a phenomenon, as an intellectual phenomenon, nationalism arose in Europe during the late 18th and early 19th centuries. That is the very beginning of our long historic 19th century. And in many ways, nationalism was a product of the French Revolution, in which the people and not the state, or the leading representatives of the state, whether it be a king or nobility, it was the people who were held to be the supreme source of political legitimization. Now, in other ways, nationalism could be said to have evolved as a reaction to the French Revolution and the French dominance throughout Europe, whether in culture or in politics, which was already the case in the 18th century and certainly culminated during the Napoleonic era, during the first decades of the chronological 19th century. So there was a reaction against this, and this was particularly the case in Germanic lands. There, at the outset of our chronological 19th century, several writers, reacting to the presence of France's Napoleonic soldiers, and reacting to the widespread use of French language and culture, cultural models by the German upper social strata, some Germans began to argue that the German language and German culture were at least the equal of French, and as such should be accorded respect, if nowhere else than in their own homeland, their own Germanic homeland. And so, whereas some German authors, like Fichte and Schelling, stressed in particular German cultural uniqueness, another influential German philosopher of the Enlightenment, late 18th century, Johann Friedrich Gottfried von Herder, and I'll put his name because his name is very important for our purposes, Herder, he argued that all cultures in the world have their own particular worth and value. According to Herder, those unique cultural values were best expressed in a people's language. This is where this idea of the importance of language comes along. In fact, there's this famous passage that Herder wrote. He was not particularly modest. He wrote a multi-volume work called Letters Addressed to Humanity. Letters Addressed to Humanity, and in 1783, Herder posed in one of these parts of this gigantic work what became a famous rhetorical question, and I quote his question: "Has a people anything dearer than the speech of its fathers? In its speech resides its whole thought domain, its tradition, history, religion, and the basis of life, all its heart and soul. To deprive a people of his speech is to deprive it of its one eternal good." Role of language. And we're going to see this over and over and over again, right until the end of this course. And this is where it comes from. Now, Herder's influence was enormous throughout Central and Eastern Europe. Why? Because he seemed to provide a universally applicable justification for pride in one's own culture, which in turn was of great importance for individuals who stemmed from peoples living in countries where their own languages and their own cultures were either unrecognized or openly scorned. Now, while nationalism spread throughout Europe after the French Revolution, its applications and its goals varied from place to place. And that depended on particular political circumstances. And in effect, one can speak of two types of nationalism. And as they are listed here, also on the bottom half of your chart, and those two types of nationalism are: one, state-imposed nationalism, and two, intelligentsia-inspired nationalism. Well, what do we mean by this? That first category, state-imposed nationalism, referred to already existing independent states whose governments hoped to gain their subjects' support by convincing them that they were united because they belonged to a certain nationality. So this is now the state promoting the idea of national identity. The second category implied to those groups who lived in multinational states where a language and culture other than their own was dominant, and therefore their leaders, or the nationalist intelligentsia, worked to convince a group of people that they form a distinct national entity, and as such were deserving, at the very least, of cultural autonomy, if not political autonomy or even independence. So that's that second kind of nationalism, intelligentsia-inspired nationalism. Now, Ukrainian nationalism, which is our subject, whether when it worked itself out in the Russian Empire, which we're looking at now, or in the Austrian Empire, which we are going to look at, I believe, beginning already next week, Ukrainian nationalism falls into this category, but before looking specifically into how it worked itself out, two more principles need to be discussed here. The first is that persons, individuals, are not born with a national identity. They have to learn of their belonging to a particular nationality. Before our historic 19th century, most people in Europe did speak a dialect of a certain language. More often than not would identify themselves according to a religious affiliation. This was a primary mode of identification. Sometimes a geographic or regional affiliation. I'm Venetian, I'm a Hamburger. At various times in the chronological 19th and early 20th centuries, small groups of leaders called the Intelligentsia set for themselves the task to try to convince the members of a particular group of their belonging to some larger nationality. And this was done by spreading their ideas via newspapers, journals, reading circles, cultural organizations, theaters. And in those cases where the government under which they lived was favorably inclined, not often, but sometimes was the case, but very important was to spread these ideas through the educational system. This diffusion of a national identity depended, of course, on a network of communication facilities. And that, in turn, was directly linked to the degree of urbanization, of industrialization, generally what we call modernization of a given society. And so in that context, control of cities became crucial for the success of national movements. Remember, I mentioned several times here that cities throughout Central and Eastern Europe, including Ukraine, were primarily inhabited by people of ethnic origin or national origin different from the surrounding population. And so, but it's cities where things could take place, and so who controls cities would be able to be in charge of a national movement. Now, if the diffusion of a national identity was in itself difficult, you have to carry it out, get the message out to the people, as difficult was the problem of disagreement among the intellectual leadership itself as to just what the national identity should be. More often than not among stateless peoples, and Ukrainians, of course, were stateless people, the intelligentsia was divided between factions identifying themselves with different nationalities. This was particularly the case in Ukraine, where there were many nationalities, as we've seen in our discussion of the human geography of Ukrainian lands. It's in that sense that the national movement resembled a kind of intellectual marketplace where rival factions propagated their wares. And since no one was born with a fully formed national consciousness, then it was possible for persons to be swayed by one or more of the competing factions amongst the nationalist intelligentsia. And so it is not surprising to find in Ukrainian lands members of the same indigenous population, coming from the same village, coming from the same family, members of these people opting to identify themselves as Poles, or as Russians, or as Ukrainians. Now, another phenomenon to keep in mind is the concept of a hierarchy of multiple loyalties, which, as you see under the category on the chart, intelligence-inspired nationalism, multiple loyalties versus mutually exclusive identity. So what does this mean? Very often in multicultural states, multinational states, certain individuals could feel perfectly comfortable with more than one, what we might call, national identity. Thus, for many residents in Russian-ruled Dnipro, Ukraine, it was perfectly normal to be both a Russian and a Little Russian, or a Russian from Little Russia, speaking Little Russian, or modern terms, Ukrainian. Many nobles of Cossack origin, who we perhaps too simplistically describe as Russified, fall into this category, as does, among others, an outstanding Russian language writer, considered one of the greatest prose writers in the Russian language in the 19th century, Nikolai Gogol, who was a staunch Ukrainian patriot from Ukraine. But as the Ukrainian national movement, or the nationalist idea, evolved, some activists became convinced that in order for their movement to survive, this otherwise natural hierarchy of multiple loyalties or identities had to be replaced by a framework of mutually exclusive identities. In other words, one could not or should not be a Russian from Little Russia or a Pole from Ukraine. One had to be either a Russian or a Ukrainian, or a Pole or a Ukrainian. And in a larger sense, the entire story of the 19th century Ukrainian national revival can be seen as the story of the conflict between this cultural framework of multiple loyalties on the one hand, and of mutually exclusive identities on the other, and how this conflict sometimes had a traumatic but also very creative impact on the individuals involved. Now finally, in this general discussion of nationalism, these intelligentsia-inspired national movements, of which Ukrainian is one example in Central and Eastern Europe, can be viewed as going through three phases or three stages. Developmental stages, as you see on your chart: the heritage gathering stage, the organizational stage, and the political stage. This first stage, the heritage gathering stage, that consisted of efforts by individuals to go out into the field, so to speak, to collect the linguistic, the folkloric, the literary, and the historical artifacts of a given people. Who are they? What are they comprised of? The second stage was one in which organizations, schools, publications were formed to propagate knowledge about the cultural heritage that was collected in that first stage. Get it out to the people, to a larger number of them. And then the third stage witnessed efforts at participation in political life, often with the intention of obtaining minimally some kind of cultural, maybe political autonomy, and then for some, actually independence. Now, during the long 19th century, the Ukrainian national movement embarked upon this classic three-stage path. Let's look now at this first heritage gathering developmental stage. It's interesting to note that the original motivation for those who contributed to this first heritage gathering stage was not based on a desire for social innovation. Rather, it was the indirect result of a search to revive something from the past. Revive something from the past. Or to use the past to acquire something in the present. The whole issue in this context concerns the Cossack elite, also known as the Starshina, the Cossack elite, Starshina. I mentioned earlier on in this lecture how in the very beginning of our long 19th century, there was a series of reforms implemented by the Russian Empress Catherine II. And in 1785, among her numerous reforms, was one called a Charter of the Nobility, a Charter of the Nobility. And after this was issued, it turned out that this Cossack elite, or this Cossack Starshina, was less concerned with protecting their autonomous homeland, the Hetmanate, whose autonomy was being dismantled. So they didn't stand up and fight for this dismantling. On the contrary, they were more interested with struggling to obtain entry into the social stratum of the Russian nobility. And when we spoke about the socioeconomic or the social structure of Ukraine, we saw how important it was to be a noble, with all of its social and, in particular, economic privileges. So that's what they wanted. They wanted into the system. And in order to prove their general premise that the whole Cossack Starshina elite, which consisted of military officers and administrative officers of this area called the Hetmanate. They wanted to prove, or to try to prove, that all of them were the equivalent of the Russian nobility. Well, in order to do this, they were forced to examine a whole host of treaties between the hetmanate, or the leaders of the Ukrainian hetman, the Cossack hetman, who were called hetmans. So treaties and agreements between these hetmans, Cossack hetmans, and Muscovite tsars, examined the charters with Polish kings and Lithuanian grand dukes, and other historic documents, including chronicles, historical and familial memoirs, genealogies, descriptions of local traditions, all to make their case that they belong in the nobility. Well, one byproduct of this practical search for legal justification to the status of nobility was an enormous interest in the past, and that before long resulted in several publications about the history of Ukraine. And it is no coincidence that the earliest histories of Ukraine date precisely from this period, the last decades of the chronological 18th century, or the beginning of our period. All of these early histories expressed a deep sense of local patriotism, a love for the Ukrainian past. They were, not surprisingly, all written in Russian, and they were all imbued with the notion that Ukrainian lands, or Little Russia, as it was known at the time officially, was a natural and integral part of the Russian imperial world. So this was the argument in these histories. And so these histories implicitly accepted the idea of what? A hierarchy of multiple loyalties or identities that we have just been speaking about. You can be Little Russian and Russian at the same time. Now, besides history, during this first phase, folklore as well proved to be fertile ground for cultivation by this intelligentsia during the heritage gathering phase of the national movement. One intellectual activist, a man named Mykhailo Maksymovych, established a reputation as a collector of Ukrainian folk songs. Several volumes he published in the 1820s, 30s, and 40s. And aside from the actual texts of the folk songs, his analysis pointed to the fact that stressing the distinctions between Russian folklore and Ukrainian folklore, as seen through their folk songs. Maksymovych's collections had an enormous impact on Ukrainian intellectuals who sought to discover the indigenous riches of their people's culture. As Herder said, they had it, they're now going out and proving it. And at the same time, pointing to the differences between their folk culture and the folk culture of Russians to the north. That other important element in this first stage of intelligentsia-inspired national movements, language, actually did not fare that well, or as well as history and folklore, among the nationalist intelligentsia, at least in Russian-ruled Dnieper Ukraine. In the Austrian Empire, as we're going to see, entirely different, but here, language was not given so much emphasis. One small grammar, a small tiny dictionary was published, but even the authors of that grammar and dictionary considered Ukrainian, or what they call Little Russian, to be just a dialect of the Russian language. Literary works, another important element, also began to appear during this period, though at least initially they too did not yet provide a basis for a vibrant Ukrainian literary movement. In fact, the first work written in what can be called the modern Ukrainian language was a work called the Eneida, which was based on the Roman tale. It was published in 1798 by someone who came to be known as the father of modern Ukrainian literature, Ivan Kotliarevsky. And some would say, since he was the father of literature, he's also the first Ukrainian nationalist, the father of the Ukrainian nationality, maybe going a bit too far. But the point is that his first work, this Eneida, was a kind of travesty using Ukrainian themes based on Virgil's classic Latin play of the same name. Indeed, the language of this work, based on the topic, seemed to suggest that Ukrainian was only appropriate for jocular and slapstick themes. So it's kind of used by the Cossacks, it's almost like buffoons, etc., etc. In short, for those who wanted to compose works, literary works, in more serious genres, it was necessary to use Russian. And this, of course, is precisely what one of the greatest Ukrainian writers of the period, as I've already mentioned him, Nikolai Gogol, actually did. Now, despite the limited achievements in language and literature, the national awakening in Russian-ruled Dnipro, Ukraine, during the late 18th and first decades of the chronological 19th century, it did make some important achievements, especially, as I've said, in the realm of history and folklore. It should also be remembered that the Russian imperial government, this may sound paradoxical, the Russian imperial government actually supported, directly or indirectly, these developments on Ukrainian lands, which we can look as the precursors of the Ukrainian national movement. So they were actually helped by the Russian imperial government. How and why? Well, first step was of great importance, the establishment of the first two modern universities on Ukrainian territory. The first one was at Kharkiv, which you know from your map where it is, in the east in 1805, and then in Kyiv in 1834. Kharkiv was set up to train officers with secular subjects and servitors in the administration. But it turns out that by the 1820s, Kharkiv became the first center of the Ukrainian cultural revival. It was actually there that the term Ukrainian was first introduced, not simply as a regional territorial name, but as the name of the ethnic name of these little Russians. And so we have the appearance of a Ukrainian Vistnyk, a Ukrainian bulletin, a Ukrainian almanac, all connected with students at Kharkiv University. Now, in contrast to Kharkiv, in Kyiv, we had the University of St. Volodymyr. It was established in 1834, but not at the initiative of a local philanthropist, as was the case in Kharkiv. Rather, it was established by the Russian government. And as I said, whereas Kharkiv University had a rather mundane purpose to train functionaries for the imperial service, The university in Kyiv had from the very outset a clear political purpose. A clear political purpose. That is, to transform the Polish-dominated right bank. Remember in our last lecture we spoke about the nationality composition of Ukraine and how Poles played a predominant role in those western right bank provinces. Kyiv was in the right bank west of the Dnieper River. And so this is what the Russian imperial government had in mind when it created this university, namely to transform the Polish-dominated right bank into an ideologically integrated part of the Russian Empire. In fact, the establishment of Kyiv University, 1834, note the date, direct result of the Polish uprising against Russian rule of 1830-31. And during that uprising, several Polish nobles from the right bank had participated. And as it turned out, the Polish revolt did not, in the end, present any serious military threat to the empire, but the revolt did reveal to the ruler at the time, Nicholas I, that 4 decades after their incorporation into the empire, remember the last partition of Poland in 1795, all the privileges given to the Poles, nothing really changed in the right bank, and yet you still couldn't trust them. The Polish nobility in the strategically located western provinces was still politically unreliable. Something had to be done. And to rectify this problem, Tsar Nicholas instructed his minister and head of the Academy of Sciences, a man named Uvarov. So we have Tsar Nicholas I, his leading minister Uvarov. He instructed Minister Uvarov with the task of transforming the Polish or Polonophile school system of these western provinces, including those in right bank Ukraine. Now these schools should become instruments of Russian imperial ideology. And in carrying out this task, Polish secondary schools were Russified. The famous Polish Lyceum, which I mentioned last time at Kremenets in Volhynia, was closed. The Polish University at Vilnius up in the north in modern-day Lithuania, part of the Russian Empire, it was transferred where? To Kyiv in 1834. So from a Polish university in Vilnius, we now have an instrument of Russian ideology in Kyiv. Uvarov specifically chose Kyiv as the site of this new institution because that city, Kyiv, was considered, from the standpoint of Russian imperial ideology, as quote-unquote the mother of Russian cities, and therefore a most appropriate starting point for Russian imperial cultural move westward. Moreover, Kyiv University and its initially small professorial staff were expected to undertake research into the history of these western provinces in right bank Ukraine, which had once belonged to the medieval entity called Kievan Rus, and therefore should now belong, from the Russian imperial perspective, ideologically as well as politically, to the Russian Empire. And it's in this process of cultural reclamation, which would train Polish youth in a Russian imperial spirit. It's in this context that this little Russian or Ukrainian movement that we are talking about could and would be used as a weapon to depolonize Kyiv and the right bank. And so the Russian imperial government helped to provide a solid basis for research into Little Russian or Ukrainian matters. And such action, of course, was simply in keeping with the empire's official ideology propounded by this minister Uvarov in 1833, namely that the ideological pillars of the Russian Empire should be orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality. Orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality. And as for that latter concept, nationality, a Little Russian identity was not only acceptable, but a desirable complement to a Russian imperial national identity. Little Russianism was, or so it seemed at the time, the first or lowest stage in a socio-cultural framework that recognized a multiple and mutually complementary hierarchy of loyalties and identities. Lastly, one has to say that there was this other trend, the concept of mutually exclusive identities. And it too had begun to be propounded on Ukrainian lands. This concept of differentiation, most poignantly presented in a work entitled The History of Rus, Historia Rusov, The History of Rus. It was composed sometime in the second decade of the chronological 19th century. Still not clear who actually wrote it, but it was finally published in 1846. And published by whom? Published by the Russian imperial government as part of its reclamation project against Polish influence in the right bank. Now, in contrast to those other earlier histories of Little Russia that began to appear in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, which I mentioned, this Historia Rusov, History of Rus, treated Little Russia not as a province of a larger Russian world. Again, it may seem paradoxical. The Russian imperial government is supporting this, at least through its publication, but rather saw Little Russia as an independent country that only recently had come under Russian hegemony. And so this Historia Rusov set up a clear dichotomy between the world of those Muscovites up in the north and that of the Little Russians or Ukrainians in the south. And in a philosophical framework of truth and justice, good versus evil, it was inevitable that the bad guy turned out to be the Muscovites. Now, this Historia Rusov may not have been a serious piece of historical scholarship, and by no means the equal of those other historical works that were being published in the late 18th, early 19th century on the history of Ukraine, but the Historia Rusov did succeed in using history to inspire a whole generation of Ukrainian patriots. And it was upon the generation of the 1840s and 1850s that this Historia Rusov was to have its most lasting impact. And that generation was led by three figures: Mykola Kostomarov, Panteleimon Kulish, and Taras Shevchenko. And it is to that story that we will return when we return next week. Thank you.